Hey everybody, this is Perch. In the video with is the Hickman run considered a failure? I mentioned that I don't like one and done comics, and a couple of you came in and say, "Hey, what's wrong with the one and done comics?" I like one and done comics, and in a world where the comics is like is $3.99, $4.99, I kind of like having a story I can just dip into and not feel like I'm tied into a $48 bill, a year on a comic. I like the one and done comics. So what's your problem with them? Well, okay, fair enough. I don't mind one and done comics in the sense of if the story is complete, if it's if it actually is meaningful, I have no issue with it. Where I have an issue with it is when the story feels like a throwaway story. So, in a title like X-Men, which for 60 years of its life has been an ongoing serialized, episodic, comic. I don't like one and dones because that's not what the comic is. That's not what it was meant to be. That's what it's made. I get that you can change anything you want, and hell, you're the publisher. You can do whatever you want. But you've set an expectation that this comic is meant to kind of be a ongoing serialized story. If you had called it like, you know, X-Men anthologies, and then you put this thing out where every story is a one and done, fine. But X-Men is the flagship comic of the X-Men universe. They've been the X-Men. You've had spin-offs before. You've had worlds where there's been never quite as much as what we have now. I thought that was not true, by the way. Somebody said that there's more spin-offs to the X-Men today than there ever has been. I'm like, no, that's not true. Back in the 90s, you had Wolverine, then you had you had X-Men, you had Uncanny X-Men, X-Factor, X-Force, Wolverine, and then you'd have random other things kind of coming and going. But as I was counting it out, and I took this challenge, I looked for, I think, 1995, I think, was the year that had the most simultaneous X-related titles in 1 month until the Krakoa era of X-Men. And there was a time in 2020 in the fall where there was 16 X books in 1 month. Anyway, regardless. The problem is X-Men is meant to be the flagship main book, and you announced you're going to do one and done, and the stories felt often disposable. The idea was that it was going to kind of flesh out the world and create this kind of atmosphere that would, it would empower some storytelling, and on it goes. That was the concept, but that's really not what we got. We got you got the plant growing grannies. You got that story, which really didn't mean much. You got a couple stories around the Summers hanging out on the moon. You had the one important story around Apocalypse and Krakoa and Araku that would later lead to some other things. But by and large, a lot of the stories felt just like half jumbled stories. I mean, you had the story of Sink, Laura Kinney, and Darwin going into the vault, and then like a year and a half went by and they didn't do shit with that thing. So you got kind of this incomplete done in one that I just went nowhere. And unfortunately, I don't think this is just limited to Hickman. I think that a lot of whenever somebody says we're going to do a done in one, oftentimes what that translates to, not just me, but people who would come into the store and buy the comics, it would translate to, yeah, we're going to do a comic of stories that don't really matter. We're going to do a comic. We're going to do just kind of stories that don't really have any stakes and nothing really major happens, and they feel like filler stories. And this is not, again, this is not isolated to just comics. I remember one of the complaints that the X-Files had, and the X-Files, for those of you who are too young, the X-Files is a science fiction show on Fox that starred David Duchovny and what was her name? Oh, well, anyway. Jill, whatever. Anyway, the TV series presented itself as having a big overarching mystery. Mulder's sister had been, kidnapped, and Sully didn't believe him, and there's a government conspiracy, and there's the cancer man, and there's all these they're guys with black goo in their eyes and all this kind of shit. Anyway, there basically was this mythology that they set up, but the episodes that are key to the mythology, the ones that were kind of carrying the the continuity stories, those ones, the canon stories, I think, as Rick and Morty would say, those were few and far between. You would see those episodes when the series launched in the fall. You'd see it again, kind of right before the holidays, and then you'd see it for sweeps, and then you'd see it for the season finale. And in between that, they do a ton of done-in-one adventures, and they weren't bad episodes. They were fine, but a lot of viewers had come to the show expecting to get a big kind of overarching story of a government conspiracy and all the rest, and instead they were like, and in this episode, Mulder and Sully go to the rain forests of Oregon and look for Bigfoot, and turns out it's just a weird mutated kind of half monster that didn't go through the evolutionary process quite right, and that the monster gets shot, and Mulder contemplates the strangeness of nature. And in the next episode, there's some kind of sand bug that makes you have seizures, and Mulder got it, but can he be cured in time? So anyway, I enjoyed a lot of those episodes. I thought they were fun. However, I also remember watching that show going, for Christ's sake, when are we going to get back to the guys who, have black oil in their eyes and they're trying to take over the world, I guess. They've got some kind of underground layer in the ice, when are we getting back to that shit? Because it always felt kind of weird that the main characters would have these huge stakes. The entire world is about to end, and these aliens are among us, and they're taking over the government, and shit, it's all going bad. But, before we worry about that, we're going to drive over to Phoenix, Arizona, and look into some water that makes people's skin turn blue, and that doesn't seem good. That's the problem that I have with them. If you set the tone that you've got ongoing storytelling and then you pivot to done-in-ones, it's weird. And so with the X-Men and kind of that series, Hickman set up these huge, big ideas in Hoxpox, and then it's like, hey, let's spend an issue looking into where the mutants grow their plant drugs to sell to other nations to improve their trade. It's like, okay. Hey, let's in this issue, Brew is going to become king of the brood somehow, and I'm sure that's cool. They're not bad stories, and they do ultimately add up to be part of the overall X-Men lore, but it left you wondering, and this was kind of the flaw, I think, in Hickman's run, and where you've seen it. When you see a comic that's built for several decades, tell kind of ongoing stories that lead into stories, and then suddenly go to done-in-one, the stories all feel short and kind of stunted. That's the problem with it. And a lot of the stories, you kind of wanted it to go a couple comics because the ideas were big enough. I mean, hell, that entry into the vault in the very first issue of Hickman's X-Men, they had these they come in and they find these the vault. The woman was captured by Orcus, I think. Anyway, you set up Orcus being big villains and the vault being a big threat. Mutants have threats on both ends now, and then you just don't come back to it for a while. You go ahead and take 10 issues and never mention Orcus again. I mean, I'm sure they're out there. Nimrod's doing something up there in the sun, but all right, we can just kind of ignore that. I don't know. That's the problem. You set up the threat and then they just vanish for half a year. And you send people into the vault, and then they just we're done with that story, I guess, for another year. That's the problem, and a lot of the done-in-ones do that. I would, you get a country. I mean, one of the best parts about Hoxpox are some of those issues where they switch the order around. It's like, hey, the mutants are invading the Orcus station at the sun, and they're going on a suicide mission to try and stop them. And then the next issue comes out like 2 weeks later or a week later, and it's like, oh shit, we keep going, we're continuing this story because it was bigger than just one comic, but they then walked away from it. So that's my problem with Done in One. Hope that makes sense. I don't know. What do you think? Am I being too hard on it? Probably. Am I being too hard on things? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Like and subscribe, of course, and thanks for listening.